It was voted one of America's most violent prisons, and now is said to be one of America's most haunted. When it was in operation, there were 36 reported murders and 94 executions. That figure is close to 1,000 when you take into account the accidental deaths and reports of suicide. So it would appear you didn't need a noose or electric chair to meet a grisly end. Today we will dissect the dark history and paranormal activity inside the Gothic-styled West Virginia Penitentiary in Moundsville, West Virginia. As you venture inside the prison, it seems to be a nest of disgruntled spirits. One of the rooms, which is said to be a paranormal hotspot, is called the Sugar Shack. This is an area where illegal gambling took place, as well as fighting, rape, murder, and drug deals. People who have visited this room have experienced cold spots and unexplained noises. Many have even heard the spirits of long-dead inmates arguing, as well as talking and whispering. The Sugar Shack does appear to be the heart of the building in many ways. If there was a deal to be had, or an attack to be planned, it would happen here. Now, many of the people who planned acts in the Sugar Shack and got caught may have found themselves in the North Hall. This was a place that housed the worst offenders, but not for crimes committed outside the prison walls, but for their violent behaviour inside. It's said that even though these prisoners would be locked away in their cells for 23 hours of the day, 2 murders still managed to be carried out. I guess you could say, where there's a will, there's a way. One of these victims was a guy named Danny, who died by hemorrhaging due to an inmate stabbing him in the eye. The other prisoner murdered was a man called William Red Snyder. He had been sent to prison for killing both his parents and then dismembering their bodies. It's said that Snyder was disliked by the inmates and had been involved in many fights in his time inside. Apparently he was stabbed 37 times outside his cell. As you can imagine, there were some nasty characters holed up in the North Hall, which makes it no surprise that visitors have experienced many paranormal things. People have heard the cell doors banging even though no one was there. Others have complained about their equipment malfunctioning and a sense of being watched, which just leads to a feeling of unease. Guests have taken photographs in the area and found anomalies in the pictures that couldn't be explained away. For those brave enough to visit, Snyder's cell is said to be very active. Now, as I mentioned earlier, executions were carried out at this prison for many years. They were done at the North Gate, which is the prison's oldest structure and many believe one of the most active areas. Until 1951, the favoured method was the noose, but after a severely botched hanging of a man named Frank Heyer, they changed the method to electrocution. The chair was affectionately termed Old Sparky. Frank Heyer was sentenced to death for murdering his wife. On the day of his execution, he was then led to the gallows with a cheering crowd surrounding the area. Sadly, his weight had not been taken into account for the calculations on the drop, but they soon realised their error after they pulled the handle. You see, as the rope took his full weight, his head came clean off, and I'm sure the crowd didn't cheer much after that. More likely they were puking instead. After this error in judgment, public executions ceased to be, and it was only by invite that you could attend. But the ghost that many claim haunts the area is a man called Orville Adkins, who was hung in 1938 after kidnapping a minister who was later found dead. This prisoner also experienced another botched hanging due to a nervous assistant who pulled the handle to the trapdoor a little too eagerly. Instead of hanging Orville, he fell 20 feet to the ground below and was said to be hurt and stunned at the fall. The guards helped him to stand and climb back up the scaffolding where he was hung correctly. Many say Orville relives his death repeatedly, as people have heard his heavy footsteps going backwards and forwards. The whole area is said to give off an evil vibe and a constant feeling of being watched. If you travel down into the basement, which, let's be fair, is never a good place to go. We have all seen horror movies and video games with the killer waiting down there to grab you. Well, visitors who willingly go down there have mentioned a ghost who wanders around and electronic equipment malfunctioning. The entity is believed to have been a maintenance guy who, after spying on the prisoners and reporting their activities back to the guards, was stabbed several times with shivs in the bathroom as an act of revenge. Well, the saying is snitches get stitches, but I don't think he thought the rule applied to him. That's a horrible way to go. In the area of solitary confinement, guests have felt cold spots and also the sensation of being touched on their backs. Also, roaming around the prison is a ghost nicknamed the Shadow Man, as he creeps around in dark places. People describe him as having no facial features and an intimidating aura. Now, one question you might ask is, are the ghosts inside only prisoners, or did any of the guards stick around too? Well, to be honest, I personally feel many of the spirits inside will be prisoners, which, considering the state of mind of some of these men, is quite frightening. Please remember though, that not all the prisoners were murderers and rapists. Some were there for other crimes like robbery or drug dealing. They may not have been violent by nature and instead were doing criminal acts out of desperation. Now, taking this into account makes the whole situation even sadder. The fear that some of these men must have experienced at the hands of the more violent. Guests and staff have reported seeing inmates in their uniforms walking the many hallways and then just as suddenly disappearing. There are also reports of unpleasant odours, ghostly mists, people being touched and even shoved hard by invisible hands. A disembodied voice has even been heard saying, "Help, I'm trapped." As you can see, there is an incredible amount of activity throughout the prison. It's not surprising though when you think about what we've discussed so far and the other events which have taken place. Let's delve a little deeper, shall we? From the start, the prison seemed destined for misfortune as it was constructed on the Adena Native American tribe's sacred burial ground. Opposite the prison is the only remaining burial mound left in the area and is estimated to be at least 2,000 years old. The West Virginia Penitentiary opened its doors in 1876, housing just 251 inmates. Some of these prisoners even helped to build the place. During this time, a report was put together that stated the living conditions inside were good, as was the food and education offered to prisoners. This all changed very quickly. Due to serious overpopulation, by 1929, prisoners were having to be 3 men to a cell. The cells were no more than 5 foot by 7 foot, with 2 men sharing a bunk and the third man having to sleep on a thin mattress on the floor. It didn't take long for the prisoners to become frustrated by their living conditions. I mean, some might say they had no room to complain as they deserved to be inside, so tough shit on them. But this wasn't just sharing a tight space together. This was cockroaches and other vermin crawling all over the place, and it only added to the hostile environment inside. One inmate named R.D. Wall was attacked by 3 prisoners on October 8, 1929, after being suspected of snitching. He was stabbed to death with blunt shivs as he walked to the boiler room. It got so bad that the guards were losing control. Prisoners were even managing to get out of their cells by picking the locks and roaming around freely. This might well be how many of the attacks happened, but you can also imagine the amount of stress and fear the prison guards must have felt over these working conditions. In 1983, Charles Manson requested to be transferred here due to having family nearby, but luckily it was declined. I dread to think how much damage Manson could have done with how manipulative he was and how people were already angry and frustrated. I'm sure by now you can understand why it was voted one of America's most violent prisons. By 1986, prisoners had taken all that they could and rioted. It seems that as well as the pest issues we mentioned, there was also bad plumbing amongst other things which culminated in lots of the men having health problems. By this time too, the overpopulation had become a joke, as there were said to be about 2,000 men inside. A group of 20 inmates calling themselves the Avengers stormed the mess hall in a well-planned out attack. It is said that 5 officers were taken hostage and handcuffed to railings. They also took this opportunity to deal with any grievances that they had with each other, as again, 3 prisoners were tortured and murdered. Finally, one of the inmates named Danny Lehman was chosen to negotiate on behalf of the prisoners. Overall, things did seem to improve as it was agreed that living conditions were inhumane and cell sizes were not adequate. Sadly, even though he tried to improve life inside the prison, Danny Lehman was later murdered by a rival gang of the Avengers called the Aryan Brotherhood, who were reported as being the most violent group inside. Now, after many years of violence and horror, the prison finally closed its doors in 1995. With 30 years of neglect and being unheated, paint now peels from the walls and this gives off an even creepier atmosphere. The building is now open for many paranormal experiences, including a 90-minute tour, a 3-hour and even overnight investigation from April to December. Are you brave enough to do this though? I think it would be fascinating, to be honest, not just for the supernatural experience, but also to get a feel firsthand at the living conditions they were experiencing. Apparently, if you do decide to visit the prison, it's recommended that you look at the psych ward, shower cages, chapel, and death row, as these are crazy hotspots too.